Hello and welcome back to Parlay. This prompt was written by True Parley Grandmaster Foot. Hope you'll enjoy listening. I'm Zandy, I'll be your host today. This prompt is about Remnant 2, a sordid love affair with Remnant 2. Mr. Foot begins. In this parlay, I want to talk about how I learned to love, unlove, rediscover, hate, and admire Remnant 2's build systems. I will spend a decent part of this parlay explaining how the game works, and I'll do my best to avoid spoilers along the way. Also, I want us to ignore the acquisition process of build pieces because that's a whole parlay onto itself, and we have enough to talk about as it is. I would agree. And to explain my journey, you must understand there is not one Remnant 2, but at least 3, and you progress through them as you continue playing the game. The first stage you encounter is when you play it for the first time. You pick your archetype in the beginning. The archetype decides your first class and starting equipment, but it's just the starting point, as all gear and all archetypes classes can be acquired later. There is little buildcraft here, as you mostly use what you find and what looks interesting. This phase ends when you beat the final boss. Interesting. I don't totally agree that there's little buildcraft there. I just feel like it's a stage of the game where you don't often have a build option that is good for whatever concept you have in mind for every slot. Something very distinct about Remnant 2 is that in this phase, you have build options. As Mr. Foot says, you mostly use what you find and what looks interesting, because you will find stuff very early. I mentioned when I was trying to explain the game to people on a stream that a distinguishing factor with Remnant 2 is that you fill all of your build slots very fast compared to similar games. You have 4 rings, an amulet, a long gun, and a whatever it's called, a side gun, a light gun, secondary, a melee weapon. There are, for non-legendary, I guess, long gun and sidearms, you have mods as well, which you can slot in and out. You have mutators for your 2 guns and your melee. These are kind of like just boosts for them. They're more like what mods sound like they are, and mutators are more like what mods sound like they are. And then you have armor. And you will have something in every slot very fast, like couple hours of gameplay. If you play a lot, probably your first play session will end and you'll have something equipped in every slot. Possibly you'll be missing like 1 ring, depending on what stuff you find. But quite quickly, you will have everything filled, which means that also fairly quickly, you'll have opportunity cost between those slots. But yes, there's little buildcraft in the sense that you may not have 4 or 5 rings that do something for a given build that are not narrow or that, fit the concept you have in mind for a little while. You'll probably just put together, whatever fits. And the initial 4 class choices are also, I would argue, pretty broad, like not very narrow, quite vanilla, I guess, for better or worse. And so while they'll probably work well with whatever you get, they definitely don't allow you to make a very focused build early on, within reason, sure. And that phase ends when you beat the final boss, right? So there is a kind of campaign. That's the way the game builds itself. You play through a campaign structure. You get lots of gear. Great. I would say the build system deserves to exist, earns its place existing in this first playthrough. But you definitely don't have maybe like complete options. There's certainly a tremendous amount more build stuff in the game than you would get in this first playthrough. Mr. Food says, I like Zandy's description of campaign, session-based, and ongoing games, and Remnant 1 and 2 are unique because they can be played as any one of these experiences, arguably, sure. You might end your playthrough after finishing the campaign and be happy with what you experienced. There's also the inclusion of a hardcore permadeath mode when creating a character, and some people would enjoy creating a new character and seeing how far they can go with the items they find. Archetypes and items unlocked through challenges are available to all characters if they're acquired once, and you might find it enjoyable to start the game as one of the unlockable classes instead of the 4 you start out with. Remnant 1 even included an explicit, for lack of a better word, roguelike-like mode, with its own gear economy that resets upon death. But what would happen if you treated Remnant as an ongoing game? Remnant 2 doesn't really have a campaign as much as it has a campaign instance. There are 3 worlds in Remnant 2, and each world has 2+1. One of them is a DLC version, SKUs that determine the main boss and the storyline of the world. So there are kind of 9 different storylines that can be slotted in, and you play 3 of them every time you play through the campaign. Each SKU also contains 2 dungeons that end in a small boss, as well as 4 optional side dungeons and 2 overworlds that connect each of those parts. And all of these contain branching paths and randomized events and quests that lead to a ton of different rewards, which are build pieces. And that is per world SKU. These 3 worlds are connected by the labyrinth, and each campaign ends in a spoiler. The labyrinth and the spoiler are not randomized, and in fact always identical, but they also take up a relatively small part of any full campaign playthrough. You could also play adventure mode, which contains 1 single world SKU of your choice. Pausing here to say that I don't think that was a particularly confusing explanation on paper, but I bet a lot of people who don't know anything about Remnant 2 are leaving that section going, what? How? What is the structure? It's not actually that complicated. You play an intro thing, you play 1 of your 3 random world rolls out of the 9 that are possible. You play through the labyrinth, which is the same every time, a sort of dungeon chunk that is a set part of the labyrinth. You play your other 2 random of the 9 world SKUs. Then you play a spoiler thing, which is the end of the game. And that's a sort of campaign run with, that level of randomization. You can also roll up a single SKU and just keep re-rolling as much as you want. That's called adventure mode. So you could view that as the sort of session-based offering for the game as well. If you play through them quickly, you can definitely beeline an adventure mode if you have robust builds in a meaningful session of play, maybe an hour, for example. But only if you don't complete everything. So if you start exploring those different places and quests, you start doing the little adventure modes, hunting down specific build pieces, you reach stage 2. At some point you'll acquire a build piece and you'll want to try and make it work. This might be a class or a weapon, maybe a weapon mod, maybe an amulet. You will look through your different build options and do your best to find fitting elements. You might even seek out items that will improve that build. Once you make your first proper build, you'll notice something. The game suddenly becomes super easy, and we're not talking about some crazy synergies, just a set of gear that vaguely makes sense together. Like I was mentioning before, you now can fill every slot with something that is good on your build. Nothing broken is occurring. You have every slot filled. You've had every slot filled since hour 2 of playing the game. But now on hour 10 or whatever, you have every slot filled with something that is good on that build. Not necessarily in a very interesting, complicated, or robust way, but they all apply to that build, extracting you significantly more power than you had before. But no worries, the game is planned for that, and it includes a total of 4 difficulties. With a decent build, you can comfortably play, and with some challenges, clear Survivor, Veteran, and probably Nightmare difficulty. This is a thrilling gameplay loop where you're constantly overwhelmed by all the great items you want to use in a build, and you might find yourself in a frenzy of experimentation, until you reach stage 3. There'll come a point where you have most of the build pieces, or just a lot. By now you've probably maxed all 11 plus 3 expansion archetypes, and access to all kinds of multipliers, not prisms, we'll get to those later. You might start to develop optimized builds, and you start to push into the final challenge of the game, Apocalypse difficulty. And this is the tier where we went pretty fast through that, but this is the transition which might take the bulk of most players' playtime, and you now have synergies that are not only every slot pulling its weight, but possibly fairly broken. They take it up a notch from just every item is good in the build. You've managed to find unique effects that create something much stronger than the sum of their parts. We'll give you a lot of examples of this later. We're just trying to give you a high-level view of what is your progression through the game's build systems feeling like. What are the different stages? And Apocalypse is hard. In Remnant 1, Apocalypse required a high level of game knowledge, mechanical skill, and team coordination if you're playing co-op. But Remnant 2 is different. You've access to way more tools, and by now you might have found one of the holes in this game's difficulty. You can achieve what is for all intents and purposes immortality via multiple methods. Some, just to name a few: Medic Prime perk, granting you infinite relic regeneration. If you're familiar with the Dark Souls series, these are your Estus flasks, your heals. Bulwark scaling, which is damage reduction, but you can convert it into a lot of other stuff. Or shield health hybrid tanking. Yes, you can get shields over your normal health bar, equal to your max HP, I believe, And there are a number of items that can give you very, very high total effective health if you are willing to build into your health and shields at the same time. Thus, you end up having a much more robust health bar than is normally possible, and you can tank hits that would normally easily kill even a tanky character with very little damage, very little risk. And those are just some of the, no offense, but some of the more obvious ones. There are definitely some like weirder ways to achieve godlike survivability that I know Mr. Foot knows as well, and we're just not going to get into that here. Maybe later, but not right now. But those tend to be boring to play. It's subjective, but I would argue a lot of them are a little monotonous. So you might gravitate toward the opposite extreme, the glass cannon damage build. If you kill things quickly enough, they'll get fewer chances to kill you, lowering the required mechanical skill. Or you might find out that Havoc form, Emperor Palpatine, no, you will die ability, is still one of the strongest builds in the game while requiring little to no mechanical skill. In any case, beating the game starts to get easy, even with the highest difficulty the game has to offer. So what's the point of Buildcraft if beating the game is easy? And thus we arrive at Stage 4. It's Stage 3, but we get access to prisms. You can pick 3 fragments for your build, giving you small stat bumps in any direction, quite literally any. In a way, I think a high point of the game's systems. You can pick basically any stat you want for these. Crit damage, evade, speed, skill cooldown, fire rate, basically whatever you want. Quite literally almost any stat that exists in this game you can pick. Prisms are a new system that allow you to get 5 to 9 additional fragments, which correspond to about 6 additional rings in terms of stats, more than your default set. And you get a legendary perk, which is equivalent to 1 to 3 additional amulets. With your new prism, you can reach new levels of power that were unreachable before, while potentially getting most benefits of both the glass cannon damage and the invulnerability of a hard tank. To illustrate the potential damage, Mr. Foot included a video that I'll link in the description, but I'll briefly show you some of the prism stats now, actually, just as a way to not spoil you on what's coming later in the parlay, but here we go. So you can see that while there's a whole variety of different stats available, you have things like health regeneration, skill cooldown, cast speed, use speed, mod duration, skill duration, and then prime perks. We have a couple of examples. You have enabling the prime perk for your secondary archetype. This is like a big passive benefit you can get from only one of your 2 multi-class classes. This relic on the left lets you have both of those big powerful passive effects. Explosive critical chance by 100%, explosions always crit. Range damage 75% higher, that's a big one, of course. You get the idea. These are huge game-changing effects and giant piles of statistical damage that you can eventually progress to acquiring. Though getting them to this level, I would say, anecdotally, having played through Remnant's campaign multiple times, I am not even close to having anything like that. I have almost everything in the base game. I haven't played the expansions yet, and I've beaten the game multiple times, and I'm at this sort of apocalypse difficulty level, but I don't even have anything close to any of these. I don't have a single prime perk. I don't have, any of these things maxed. You might get them more or faster when you play Apocalypse difficulty, but yeah, it takes a while. This is definitely this is not part of the game unless you play a lot, several entire playthroughs. Let's see how much time it says I have in Remnant. We're going to cut off a good couple of tens of hours where I might have been AFKing or in a stream. It says 116.2 hours on Steam. I would say it feels more like 80 hours to me, but suffice it to say, a lot, a good amount of time. And I'm not even close to having that stuff. That's just anecdotally, but again, the acquisition process of prisms surpasses the scope of this video. Yeah, it's complicated and boring. You don't want to know. If you play Remnant 2, look, it'll be fine. But if you don't, it's certainly not an interesting thing to hear about the game now. And you'll be playing for at least 80 hours before it matters. So there you go. That's just me. But putting that aside, I still hated the prism system when it came out. Mr. Foot continues, because it made a game supposedly about overcoming challenges even easier. And this is honestly not me trying to be elitist or claiming that the game should be hard to beat. It's just that I had an expectation that this kind of experience Remnant 2 was going to be providing from playing the first game and from the expectation promise that the beginning of the game provides, that the beginning of Remnant 2 provides, was just kind of broken in the sequel and obliterated after the introduction of prisms. Yeah, I agree, Mr. Food. I'll defend you there. That's not elitism. It isn't. The game definitely sets you up to feel like it will be that way. Something we'll talk about a lot in this parlay later is how Remnant 2 really isn't the same game later on. It has that classic problem where a game with robust build systems often just becomes about something completely different when you get to the end game. And it's funny, initially I would have said that Remnant 2 kind of countered this. After all, you get a bunch of build options really early. And a highlight of Remnant 2 is that build options are either not levelable, so like rings and amulets have the end game level of stats they're going to have right when you acquire them. Hour 1, you will probably get a ring that is viable on hour 200, and that's awesome. You get more of them and they synergize better, and that's how you scale, not by you getting ones that are just better than others. At least they tried hard to do that, mostly successfully. And weapons are always acquired at level 0, and those are balanced to be sort of at the same point. So while higher difficulties and later bosses might ask you for more damage, you get that by leveling your weapon. No matter when you acquired it, you're going to need to level it up. You get a weapon from beating the final boss, and it's a good weapon if you level it up, just like you have to level up every other weapon, including the starting weapon you got at the beginning of the game. Many of those starter weapons are like endgame viable, frequently used by Apocalypse difficulty players' weapons once they've been leveled up. And so everything is kind of evened out that way. You would think that this would mean that the game is kind of about buildcraft from the start, and it won't unbecome about that. It won't become about something different later. But I would agree with Mr. Food. This is not true in practice. The level of power you get from this game's synergy package is so large that I would argue that the tone of the game does change from early on. I would argue that the bosses are certainly much harder where I'm playing now, but the game is much more about my build and how powerfully it can kind of push back against the boss's mechanics, which I think is really fun, but it's really not the same as the like Dark Souls-like experience that I got in the beginning of playing the game, where you might more accurately, reductively, but somewhat accurately call the game Dark Souls with guns, where dodging things and carefully timing out when you do damage to the boss was much more important than it is later in the game. For sure, that's not being elitist. The game does set that up and create a tone like that, and then it does undermine it. I would argue that somewhat objectively, that is a thing the game does. It's not your fault that that's like that. Why then, Mr. Foot concludes, did I turn around to loving the build systems in this game? It's simple. I have let go of the promise that was stuck in my head, and I've started playing the game as a puzzle game. Sure, I can break the game 10 times over with a number of different builds, and because of the way you can respec in this game, you can do that instantly at basically any time. There are many build pieces suited to a just give me the good stuff approach. But I find my fun in taking build pieces that seem cumbersome and awful at first, and finding ways to make them work. This riddle-like process has led me to items I had written off as useless and powerful builds. Prisms that can then fill in gaps, provide solutions to, and even add new riddles for you to solve. This has been extraordinarily fun for me and made me discover just how balanced the game really is, in a way. The DLC offered additions to build areas that were lacking before. The 3 new archetypes meaningfully expanded the design space, focusing on status effects, offensive skills, and shields, respectively, which were 3 areas that were underserved in the base game. I'll provide some of these gameplay puzzles below without spoiling the solutions I'd found. Yeah, we'll show you some items in a minute. Even with the worst offenders, builds that are basically immortal usually suffer from slow gameplay. Effective, but there's no reason to go that slowly. Havoc form has 0 weaknesses, but it is boring and I cannot bring myself to play that build for more than 10 minutes. And glass cannon builds still require good game knowledge and mechanical skill. They lower it, but without removing it. They can and will die regularly unless you, the player, are a god of damage avoidance. What are your thoughts on finding the balance between exploration, challenge, and finding your own fun in builds? What an epic lead-up of Parlay. Pretty cool. Just before I get into answering, I think let's show people some of those examples of build stuffs. So here we have some examples from Mr. Food. Let me move out of the way a little more of like good stuffy things and less good stuffy things. So you can see here we have some good stuff pieces. 0 Hour, Ankh of Power, and Soul Stone. Ankh of Power says, gain a 15% increase to all damage. Consuming a relic, healing, increases the bonus to 25% for 15 seconds. 25% non-conditional bonus to all of your damage if you use a relic every 15 seconds. And even if you don't, it only drops down to 15%. This is very good as the game's offerings go. That is a large bonus. You can certainly get more out of your relic, but for doing less, perhaps not. You know, that's a lot. Soulstone says increases summon damage by 30% and summon movement speed by 30%, 50%. Anyway, there are a lot of summons. Many things that are just like a feature of a class count as a summon. So there's the handler who has a pupper with them, a doggo. That counts as a summon. Engineer summons a turret. That counts as a summon. It counts as like a minion, a summon. There's a summoner class that makes summons. Yep, they count as summons. There's the new Warden subclass from the Dark Horizon DLC, and I don't have that, but I believe that drone counts as a summon. Be very consistent with the rest of the game. There are a lot of summons. That's not a very niche thing. 0 Hour says increases all damage by 20% and crit chance by 10%. Each weight class above light reduces the damage bonus by 5% and the crit chance bonus by 2.5%. So if you wear more armor, if you have heavier gear, then you get less of that bonus. But it's certainly a very large bonus if you're willing to have less damage reduction. Cool. On the other hand, we have things like these riddle build pieces. We have Timekeeper's Forfeit. Increases status damage by 50%, but applying a status effect to an enemy also applies that effect to you. And what will you do about that? You could maybe leverage it to get more damage or try to find a way to get it off really elegantly, you could imagine. Again, I have some thoughts about these, but we won't get into it here. That's not really the point. Canine Keepsake says increases all damage by 2.5% and crit chance by 1.5%, crit damage 1.5%. For every 5% of total health present as gray health. You get this when you've taken damage, but you haven't taken damage again. The health damage you took will be gray health. You can regenerate this or get it back in some special ways. And there are also items that will turn your health into gray health, which has basically damaged you, but it still applies as gray health. A very odd mechanic in Remnant 2 that's a little hard to explain, but this is a pretty spicy one if you can figure out how to crack it. That's a lot of damage boosts. If you have the full stacks, it says for every 5% of total health present is gray health. Max 10 stacks. So 50% of your health is gone, but is gray health. Then you get 25% to all damage and 15% crit chance and crit damage. That's a lot. I mean, compared to those generalist options, that's a big step up from that Ankh, and you don't even have to use a relic all the time. You just have to have half of your health be gray health all the time. Ooh, but it's a fairly big reward. Chef Metal, this one's neat. On perfect dodge, automatically trigger effects that require relic use to activate. So anything that says on relic use, like that Ankh from before, for example, these are amulets, but anyway, if they were separate, on relic use effects will trigger when you do a perfect dodge. There are even some abilities that count as doing a perfect dodge, which would now count as using a relic, and you could potentially chain a lot of effects together that way. A Rube Goldberg machine style of setting up a build. I'm not going to go into the weapons too much, but just as a quick highlight, Redeemer over here, to get out of your way, says that when you use your relic, Redeemer stores the relic use effect and then can fire it with its next shot, or when you activate the mod. So this allows you to shoot healing into allies, or some relic effects do not heal. I'll just leave that there for a little while. So yeah, pretty cool. But let's get into answering the question at hand, which was, what are your thoughts on finding the balance between exploration, challenge, and finding your own fun in builds? This is a tricky one. I mean, I would say the thing I want to talk about is this path through the game's build systems that you laid out, Mr. Foot. You've presented to us a picture of progressing through the game where there are lots of different stages of how the buildcraft feels. And I want to get back to that thing we talked about earlier, where I was saying at first you would think this kind of counters that problem that many non-session-based build systems have, where the game really isn't functionally about build systems until much later, at which point it rather significantly changes. The classic example for me has always been something like World of Warcraft. Even though I don't think it has really good build systems, I think it has really bad build systems. It's not trying to be about that exactly. But the situation is that for a given class, let's say Warlock, that's what I played when I first played WoW, you have Demonology, Affliction, and Destruction. Those are your different trees, the different things about being a Warlock. Demonology is summoning demons, so like Minion Master thing. Affliction is damage over time, like curses, and there's a good amount of lifesteal in there as well. And Destruction is what you would expect. You know, you throw fire and brimstone and shadow magic and stuff. And these are different ways to play. And as you level, there are advantages to playing one way or the other, sure. For example, Demonology, if you're a solo player, allows you to summon something like a Voidwalker, which is a big tanky blueberry looking dude. My mom calls him a blueberry. And when we played together when I was younger, we used that to tank because she played a mage. We were both squishy, so you can use that to tank, sure. You can also summon other demons that add to your damage or whatever you need, really. You don't have to do that. Affliction is pretty good at keeping you alive if you want to, and Destruction has some stuns, and you have a fear effect as a Warlock, so it's not like you can't play the other ways. It would be a matter of play preference. But when you get to later in the game, this is no longer really the case. The game then becomes about which of those specializations was designed for, you know, raiding or PvP or whatever. And if you like Demonology, but you want to raid, depending on the moment in the metagame, most of the time I played, that simply isn't the one that does 10% more damage. And in a game designed around 10% more damage, where bosses enrage after a set amount of time, you more or less must use, you know, whichever one is the meta one, often Destruction, though there was a period I played where it was Affliction. And I'm sure there were times when Demonology would have been fine, by the way. That's not the point. The point is to illustrate, as you got to the end of the game and actually got all the build options online and the difficulty kind of caught up, the meaning of the build systems in the game really changed. On my game spreadsheet, I have World of Warcraft's build system rated as an F, and the reason is not that I think World of Warcraft is bad, but because the build system is a lie. It's not really there so you can pick something. And yet it even does the extra evil of tricking you into thinking you are supposed to pick something, but then at the end of the game is hardcore designed to not allow you to pick something. That's just not good. It would be better if it either did allow you to pick things, basically they just balanced it tighter, or split the balancing, but that's a whole subject in MMOs. Or if, as you leveled up, they treated those things as being separate, or maybe even telegraphed, like, hey, Demonology is just going to do less damage, so just be prepared for that when you get to later in the game, or something like that, you know. I don't know, there are any number of ways you could do it. It's kind of baked into the game's design, though. And a lot of games have this problem. The kind of parallel problem would be, well, for me, the last game it happened was in Cyberpunk 2077, where if you make a build using every tool at your disposal, you will outstrip the game's difficulty scaling by the end. However, if you were to then move the difficulty up, you would find the game too hard at the early game because you don't have build options yet. No difficulty is at all a good match if you actually use the build systems to near their fullest potential. Actually, another example would be Nier Automata, where I think that's a bit of an issue. The higher difficulties might be really hard at the very beginning, but then a good fit later on if you plan to use the build systems, and they're really only just right, you might imagine. I don't know, but I would imagine, for players that don't dig as much into the build systems. A lower difficulty won't be outscaled later in the game, even though you, no offense, you easily can in many of these games if you utilize the build systems. They're not very well designed for that. Now, Remnant 2 here, we have a really weirdly different situation where it's not really that the game doesn't work at any stage of play, or that the game is like lying to you about it being about buildcraft. It shows you that it will be about build options early on, and it gives you them early on, and the ones you're given are good early on, and they don't like secretly become unviable later. And that's all really good. So they solved it, right? But weirdly, it actually goes on to have its own strange problem. It's not totally a problem, where you kind of the significance of the build system changes as you go. I've been thinking a lot about what is happening here. Like, what is the contents of the thing that's going on here? Is it that the build options are too strong? Is it that they're too impactful? And thus, when you get build options that create a lot of synergy, you get such a dramatic bump in power that you breeze past a whole level or two of the game's difficulty. And you go from, for my experience, for example, I started on Veteran, which is the second lowest difficulty of the four. And I thought it was reasonably easy through my first playthrough, but then I got a complete build up and running, and I immediately jumped all the way over Nightmare difficulty. If you've seen when we were playing on the stream, most of that gameplay was like the moment I have good builds online, fully, built builds online, we've already breezed all the way past all of Nightmare difficulty. It's now like Apocalypse would be hard but doable. You know what I mean? That's too much of a jump. We went too far. So I'm not really sure what to say there. You could argue that doing something like reducing the number of ring slots would help. So make it so the player has less different build knobs to modify their power. And thus, it's not like they start the game with 3 rings, 4 rings, and amulet weapons. Yes, they have them. They have the, power budget of those items, but they're not kind of combining together. And then they suddenly get 3 or 4 rings times the amulet's effect, times their weapons. Obviously, that's a bit hand wavy, but you get my point. Maybe if there were just less ring effects that were being kind of magnified by having a synergistic build, then the gap between, like, you have items in those slots and you have synergistic items in those slots wouldn't be as extreme as it is, which it really is. I definitely agree with your way of presenting it. Basically, the moment you have something kind of good in every slot, the game relatively quickly becomes noticeably dramatically easy in a way I have rarely experienced in other games. That's odd from synergy, and in a way it's like that's good, in a way I want that. I don't want the game to not be that your build decisions are really impactful, but we see here that there's still a significant drawback. Though you could even go so far as to say maybe something like having the increased difficulties allow you more ring slots would be an interesting approach. What if you can only equip 2 rings on Survivor, 3 on Veteran, 4 on Nightmare, and 5 on Apocalypse, and then you make Apocalypse a little harder? You would need to adjust them a little bit, but, something like that. After all, you probably have more gear at those further levels, so that might kind of match up in a way. I don't want to problem solve too much because I feel like it's not so much that this is an issue, it's just strange, and I'm trying to reorient my brain to this situation as I've been playing it myself. But you see what I'm getting at here? The idea that there's this way in which the game kind of does the thing we wanted from those negative examples. You get the build options right from the start, so it's not going to be like, oh, if you use the build systems, you outstrip the difficulty at the end, but not at the beginning. Well, we fix that because you get build options right away. And the game isn't going to like not be about making builds or be about making builds and then switch that because you're getting build options all the way. And when you go to the higher difficulties, you sort of get there by making like a synergistic build. So that's good, right? And yet we're noticing there's kind of an additional problem created by those circumstances. The second thing to turn to might be something like balance. It's easy to say from your armchair game dev position with your tumbler of whiskey, yes, they truly need to balance the game more, something like that. And I don't know. I think that, Mr. Foot, you bring up one thing that's a really relevant point here. It's really easy to store and respec between 8, I think you get 8 build slots in this game. And so already, like at my less progressed point in the game, I have a library of 6 or 7 pretty solid builds that I can use to problem solve various things. Boss that's killing me, but I'm solo, switch to this build where my dog can self-revive me and I have a minion master thing going on so that the minions can draw fire. Need to survive damage that from an attack you just can't avoid. Zandy just can't dodge at the right time. Skill issue, just delete the skill issue by using this build that makes you basically immortal in one of the like 20 ways that you can do that. I have 2 of those actually at the moment that I'm currently trying to fuse together into one, but not quite there. need to do big bongo damage during a narrow boss window, you can use this build that does preposterous burst damage, but then has a long downtime, like cooldown based burst damage, etc. And so, as you say, Mr. Food, I definitely think one thing about the balancing that kind of not fixes it, but is a suitable alternative, is that you can judge what kind of experience you want to have as a player. You could argue that this is the only practical form of balance. The reason it's so ridiculous, even though understandable, tempting, to lean back in your armchair and say, just balance things good, it's a skill issue on the developer's part, is because it's not really possible for mere mortals to balance all of these insane build options. And you know what? I would agree. I think in the grand scheme of build systems and games, they did a pretty good job. I think you'll be impressed by that when you play Remnant 2. There's simple things like when you get a ring, generally you'll notice that the stats on the ring have been very carefully power budgeted. Here's a simple example. There's a ring that gives you 7% to all damage. Rings that give you damage, but only under a specific condition, will reliably give you like 10% more damage, or maybe 12 or 15% if the condition is narrow enough. Fairly precisely mathed out. Now that's nothing fancy. To be blunt, that is actually pretty easy. And they've done that pretty systematically, and that's great. But there's further things. There's lots of moments where they've thought about, well, but what other sources of this effect are here? There are moments where the ubiquity of a status is taken into effect. This ring gives you 2 stacks of bulwark for more damage reduction, basically all the time, and this ring gives you 3 stacks of bulwark, but you have to have taken damage, so that's going to be up just that implaceable amount less of the time. Things like that, where it's very thoroughly balanced that way. They've thought through those basic things. And there's more elaborate things as well, where combos of items, you can see that it was pretty obvious to combine those items, and so the developer had their eye on that combination and tweaked the balance a little bit that you can really feel when you notice it. If you've played with the Ring of Omens and the Yaisha Amulet combo, just to say one that's an incredibly minor spoiler that you probably won't find unless you look up anyway. That one, you will notice if you play with a build that uses that combination of items, that the developers are with you and have seen that combination and have made sure that it's like good, but in an interesting way instead of just unbelievably broken. I mean, it is kind of unbelievably broken, but anyway, they reined it in a little bit. Because that leads to it being a more interesting choice rather than just once you know about it, it's so obviously better than everything else that there's no interesting merit to not using it except that you just like are bored of using it. Okay, but that being said, having the player just be bored of using one option isn't necessarily bad. Have it be that the player can clear the difficulty if they want to, but it's like, but how do you want to do it? You've played through the campaign already. Do you need to be able to beat this higher difficulty? What do you find fun? Inviting the player in that way by having them go through the game once, and then they can choose to play more if they want to. They've got kind of a ramp to test the power of their stronger builds, but then if things get really powerful, they can choose to bring it back, is, I think, a good situation to have with your players. It's not a replacement for balancing the game. And indeed, I think it's telling that this game that does that unusually well actually also has unusually good balance. Like there's something there. But basically my overall point is, I guess option number 3, I think it's better to think of this as getting the player on your side. A more systematic approach where you say, look, player, I want to convince you that it's fun for the difficulty to be stimulating, and then let you tell me what is stimulating. Give you enough tools to do that, and then get something interesting going. And I think you can do this in a couple of different ways, by blurring the line of what is rewarding or valuable, and by giving the player many different options of how to become powerful in different ways. You kind of already said the second one, Mr. Fruit, things like the glass cannon playstyles, different ways to stay alive or do damage in a powerful way, but that arguably kind of deletes the skill factor. It doesn't have to be about that. You can delete that if that's what you find fun. Mostly what I enjoy in this game, being honest with you. And then the player can just engage with it alongside difficulty options and being able to dip your toe in difficulty options. When you reroll in adventure mode, you see, you can have it be a difficulty that is different from your campaign. Want to dip your feet into apocalypse difficulty? Roll up an adventure mode of something and just play one SKU as an apocalypse difficulty mode. See how it is, decide if you like that, there you go. Or play Apocalypse difficulty campaign, but take a break with an adventure mode that is Nightmare difficulty instead. Something like that. I know I've done that quite a bit already in my time playing, and it's nice to have the break. Or maybe your co-op buddies aren't on, and that your team synergy that you've set up or something isn't fully online unless they're with you, so the game is more fun at a different difficulty. Whatever. But then the other thing is having the game's reward structure be just so that while it's not unrewarding to clear a higher difficulty, it's primarily rewarding to just play more and then you decide how you want that experience to go. I think that Remnant 2 does this with, I'm only going to dip my toe in this pond, don't worry, Mr. Foot, how you get new items, primarily through side puzzles and just playing more world, not necessarily beating more world. There are a number of things where you beat a boss in a new way or something, and you get a reward for that. Yes, those exist. Rewards for beating the difficulties, like that spoiler thing at the end of each campaign run, beating that does give you a certain reward. Yes, those are in the game, but the vast majority, lion's share of rewards in the game, are from either going through the open world, and each zone will have like a ring or an amulet on the ground. This is random from that area's loot table, or from doing the side dungeons or puzzles, and then you'll get, the piece of loot either assigned to that or again something from a random loot table. This means that it's primarily just you play more of the game generally, not primarily by you progressing through harder difficulties that you get more stuff. And thus you've created an environment where the value of power exists but is nebulous, and the value of quality of life therefore has room to catch up. You put the player in a situation where it's not like making something good it doesn't matter. I think that would be unstimulating in some way. And yet it's nebulous enough that the player can choose to put the value of quality of life on the same stage as the value of power. I believe this is the more fun way to play most games, and it's just good to design a game that way because you encourage players to embrace that fun way to play most games. Many games that do not do this, I kind of try my best to play that way anyway, because there just isn't a need to play another way. Usually their difficulty balancing is more loose, but they thus do not pressure you to play in a more fun way either. And not every player might find this the more fun way to play. But I think that balance is really good, having it be that it's beneficial to make something stronger, but not to such a degree that the player gets fixated on only how powerful something is. Very similar to the problem that examples like World of Warcraft have. It's not bad the way the game's raid encounters are designed to be fun, which they are for the people that like them, requires that the bosses have, a set timer or an enraged timer in some way. So it's fine. Like, a drawback of that design is that you kind of can't give the player as much optionality for their build, but that's just not necessarily all good. Like, that has a drawback, that's all. And so here, creating a little vaguer value is maybe a little better. There are bosses that have an enraged timer-like gameplay flow, but making it more vague means you're in a better situation if you just care like 5% less about how powerful your build is. You're fine with that. There's a little bit of wiggle room. The whole point of enraged timers in the first place is that after 10 minutes, the boss doesn't instantly kill you all, it enrages and nearly instantly kills you all, meaning if you're about to win, then you can try to push it through while the boss one-shots the entire raid group, and you just might. I've certainly won raid encounters that way back in the day. And Remnant maybe takes that a step further. Take it a few steps further, and you create a situation where the player wants to kill the boss faster, and there's a coherent reason to do so, but like exactly how much faster, that just doesn't matter enough that they need to get preoccupied about that. I think that is part of the special sauce here. The prism situation is also kind of interesting to me. Like, I think, just to end on a weird note, where it kind of falls apart for me a little is I do think the prism system just kind of doesn't belong in the game, sort of. Like, I think what you said is interesting. It gives you a lot more knobs to sort of fill in build puzzles that you find interesting, but the prism system for me is an example of where the game gives the player so much more power beyond that equilibrium we just established that it kind of breaks again a little bit. And the only upshot of the prism system is that it takes so long and is such a pain to do that most players probably will just never have it. I think it's very uncommon that players who, the players you'll hear about have it. Sure, Mr. Food, the player writing a parlay about this, of course, is one of the people that has it. But I would guess something like 5% or less of all humans who play Remnant 2 will ever get one maxed prism. It just takes way too long to level them. That's just my impression. I think if you play all the content the game has to offer, sure, maybe you'll have a legendary prism, but you might not have all the fragments maxed. It's not going to have been min maxed. You just will level one prism all the way to level 51 one time. And so you could argue, like, it doesn't really matter for most players, but for players that get all the way through these phases, the game has achieved arguably a really nice equilibrium of balance between power is good, but only nebulously, and so it's okay to care about quality of life. You're kind of enabled or pushed to care about that more. But then prisms, I would argue, kind of break that back again. And so, as Mr. Food says, it becomes that you may very well enjoy them, but you're probably only going to enjoy them if you mostly abandon the appeal of the game thus far and turn it into kind of a puzzle build experience, where you make builds that do unbelievably weird things and go into that sort of transcendent realm of buildcraft, where you rise into the heavens and use the game's build systems as a kind of language to manipulate reality. I'm not saying that's unfun. It is fairly different, I think, from the appeal that the game offers up until that point. But interesting. Personally, the prism system reminds me a little bit of like Warframe, but if you had way more trouble switching out mods, where the game eventually gives you so much opportunity cost. If you ever actually get all of the parts of Warframe's loadout system online, you have Archon fragments, and you have heavy weapons, and you have your operator, and you have focus all the way leveled, and you have modded weapons in every slot and a fully leveled prime warframe and a leveled companion. You have so many places that you can add stuff to a build that the game's difficulty sort of blurs, fades out, and it's more about you being able to manipulate reality. This can remain fun if you are committed to making builds that are fun, that are enabling something you uniquely just want to do. But there will no longer really be a reason. Like, power and difficulty scaling have kind of become incoherent at that point. I guess that's my quibble, is all. So personally, I'm not that much of a fan. I kind of agree with your take at the beginning, Mr. Food. And I also think the way you worded, like, I ended up really enjoying the build systems again with prisms for this reason, that makes a lot of sense to me as well. That, certainly there's an appeal here. It's just quite different than the appeal that was there before, definitely. I wanted to say, as a kind of closing thought, that I think the idea of a game appealing to players as a session, campaign, and ongoing experience at the same time, I feel like Remnant 2 isn't the best example of this, but it's not a bad example, and that subject is very interesting. So I thought it was cool that you brought that up. It's also interesting to consider how Remnant 2 is coming close, as we've presented it, to a game that could give you different kinds of build fulfillment side by side. I'm not sure it currently does that. It gives you different kinds of build fulfillment in a sequence, and you better like the sequence that it does them in. But you could imagine a game that manages to give you those different build appeals in the same game, but alongside each other, and I think that would be really cool. It reminds me a little bit of the trend in a lot of games to add a roguelike mode as a kind of side activity. In particular, I'm reminded of Genshin Impact, not really, Limbus Company, and especially Arknights, which have a lot of different, like, significant riffs on their gameplay. Arknights has, normal missions and the challenge modes of missions, which are more strict on how many enemies you can leak, and contingency contract daily missions, where you kind of build craft your own difficulty, a bit like the Hades Pact of Punishment, if you're familiar with that, to get more points, and then you try to beat that difficulty to score those points. It has integrated strategies where recruiting units costs a resource in that run equal to their rarity, and so you want to use like lower rarity units to kind of bootstrap into higher rarity units. That's interesting in its own way. And these things kind of remix the build systems for people that just want to throw a bunch of power at it, that want to come up with unique ways to complete stages, that just want to do a bunch of different challenges, that want to play with the weaker units and see how well they can do with the basic mechanics, and etc., kind of all alongside each other. And because those things all give you rewards that all let you level up your units that are shared between all the modes, you kind of make progress no matter how you play the game, which is a very cool idea. You could definitely go further with it than these games are going, though, and I think that would be very interesting. I'm not sure we're going to find a game like that. In my opinion, this is a relatively new thing in game design. There might be a lot of games that did it in the past that I don't know about, but in my mind, this is a fairly new thing, and I think it is, yes, very good. Good, yes, do that. If you're a game designer in any capacity, look me up. I'll look you up. Thanks for the parlay, Mr. Food. I really enjoyed it. Folks, if you'd like your own parlay like this one, you can read how to do that in the description. For now, I've been Zandy, and I'll see you in the next one.